Hey, it's your old pal Lucid Stu again. Not too long ago, CNN Travel ran an article about high-speed rail in which it postulated that Chicago to New York City was possible along Amtrak's Lakeshore Limited route. They used the sophisticated method of dividing the length by 160 and came up with a time of 6 hours and 3 minutes. I decided to take a simpler approach and actually build out the route in Unreal Engine 5 to see if it's really possible to get Lakeshore Limited service down to 6 hours and estimate how much that might cost. For reference, the current Lakeshore Limited takes at least 19.5 hours in service with 18 intermediate stops between Chicago and New York. A 160 mile per hour average will require significant alterations of the existing route. To give you an idea, I calculated how long that would take if we could snap our fingers, electrify and grade separate that entire corridor, and run Amtrak's new Alstom Avelia Liberties on it. Those are tilting trains, so they handle curves a little better, and they have a top speed of 160 miles per hour on the Northeast Corridor. I have that taking 9.5 hours with 7 stops. We'd never be able to do 6 hours with 18 stops, so we're cutting it down a little. For our 6-hour train, we'll go with the Siemens American Pioneer 220. This will be an advanced American-made version of the Siemens Velaro, which is used throughout the world. This new variant will be capable of a top speed of 220 miles per hour, but we will cap it at 200 as is common practice in Europe. We're going to start our adventure on the west side of our route in Chicago, Illinois. That will begin at Chicago Union Station, and for the purposes of this video, we will assume that Union Station and adjacent Amtrak yards are completely electrified. Traveling south out of Union Station is quite slow with a large switching section, a couple of at-grade crossings, and a movable bridge over the Chicago River that would impede our train's speediness for the first couple of miles. It's worth noting that upgrading this particular route has not been suggested in any recent studies. One reason for that is likely the large amount of obstacles it would pose in the Chicago area, some of which I will show you. South of the Chicago River, the route passes several rail yards. Like many freight rights-of-way through Chicago, this one is very wide, enough for 10 conventional tracks. There appears to be room for consumption of 2 tracks and extra room for catenary structures if the freight rail company would cooperate and reconfigure their existing yards and tracks. This is a big assumption, but we do have some examples out in California where both Union Pacific and BNSF have worked with the California High-Speed Rail Authority in accommodating that high-speed rail line where it is within or adjacent to freight right-of-way. Precedent in the California High-Speed Rail Authority's recently released draft environmental impact statement for their Los Angeles to Anaheim segment indicates that electrified service adjacent to freight without a barrier would be in the 90 to 110 mile per hour range. If you haven't seen that video, check it out. I assume a similar situation here, and speed would also be constrained by geometry as the route curves over Interstate 90, CTA Metro tracks, and the Metro Rock Island line on what would be about a 100-foot flyover ramp. Adjusting this curve to maintain 90 miles per hour through the area would require the destruction of several homes, and of course, such high viaduct structures would not be cheap. At this point, we'll start a running tally of structures lost and overall cost. Now's a good time to mention my cost estimation algorithm. This takes factors like construction type and the surrounding area into consideration. Historically, its results have stacked up pretty well against more sophisticated estimations. I have also adjusted those results up 60% due to recent large cost estimate increases by both California High-Speed Rail and Brightline West, which are the 2 prime examples of high-speed rail construction cost in the US. About 6 miles southeast of that impressive curve, we'll need to go over the Calumet River on a rather expensive bridge. I did the same thing in a video about hypothetical high-speed rail from Chicago to Indianapolis. Go check it out. Who doesn't like having fun in Indiana? In the comments, people gave me crap about the bridge and said tunnels would be better. I looked at it again for this video. I don't think tunnels are all that probable, and I'm sticking with bridges. The major expense here is because the navigation height for the fixed bridge is something like 125 feet. Last time I wasn't doing renderings in Unreal Engine yet and wasn't totally sure it would work. Looks good in UE5, so I'm convinced. In that video I capped speed at 110 miles per hour. Here we need to make it to New York City in 6 hours, so we're going to take this hefty bridge at close to full speed. Same goes for what would be a second similar bridge another 6 miles to the southeast in Indiana. After that we pass by Gary, Indiana, and also Indiana Dunes National Park. I think Gary is a great place to stop, but it's only about 25 miles from Chicago, and our 7 intermediate stops in this video are going to be about 100 to 150 miles apart each. Indiana Dunes National Park borders come pretty close to the rail right-of-way here, which would force a high-speed train to stick pretty close to freight right-of-way through the area. Now that we're out of the Chicago area, let's change it up a little. Since covering every mile of the route would result in a 5-hour video, I'm going to give you the stops and an example of what would need to be done on the way to turn this freight route into a high-speed passenger one. We're on our way to South Bend, Indiana, between Chesterton and LaPorte. There is a curvy part around some hills and valleys that represent too much grade variation for freight, so the line curves around. For high-speed rail, we want fast and straight rights-of-way, and the power of our trains means we can scale much higher grades than freight. This means we're able to power through this area with a straight and a couple of big curves, all at 200 miles per hour instead. About 35 miles east of that area is South Bend, home of our favorite former mayor and former Secretary of Transportation, Mayor Pete. A running theme in this video is that getting through larger cities isn't going to happen quickly. We also can't really go around European style because most US cities are very suburban. Even though South Bend only has a population of about 120,000, the suburbs extend out 6 miles to the south of downtown. That's not terrible, but there also isn't any transit connecting those areas. Trying to circumvent to the north is twice as far, so we'll go through. The freight tracks here would need to be reconfigured to make room for our separate electrified passenger tracks. We're assuming the freight companies will begrudgingly cooperate, but won't want to be constrained by catenary over their tracks or by platforms causing issues for oversized loads. That leaves just enough room to reactivate the old South Bend Union Station. One reason there's so much room here is that the original station had 2 island platforms. There you can see that this concept would be much simpler if freights would agree to some standards for electrifying existing tracks. Freight tracks wouldn't be fast enough in the vast majority of places for high-speed intercity service, but they would provide ready access to city cores at slower speeds. From Chicago, Illinois to South Bend, Indiana on this route, it is 85 miles. I have that taking 36 minutes for an average of 141 miles per hour, so we're starting off a little below target. If we're talking about straight fast sections outside of the city and slower sections within, a very suburban section like the one between South Bend and Elkhart can be an issue. That's about 15 miles, and our high-speed train can't afford 15-mile stretches at 90 miles per hour. Here we'll enter a 5-mile tunnel to avoid the difficulties that Elkhart poses. Beyond that, freight tracks have a jog in Goshen, Indiana, which can't be corrected without taking out half the town, and that would require another 5-mile tunnel. A cheaper, more practical option would be the European bypass of the entire area. There you can see the possible advantage of a high-speed bypass with inner-city access through freight rail cooperation that would allow local access and provide high-speed through service. Between South Bend and Toledo, Ohio, the Norfolk Southern line that the Lakeshore Limited uses encounters many towns spaced about 5 to 10 miles apart that were built up along the tracks in the era before automobiles. This is pretty common for rural freight routes in the United States, and it occasionally renders them less than ideal for high-speed rail. Around Kendallville, a bypass to the north appears preferable. Something like that could extend 40 miles in a east-west line into Ohio before rejoining the freight right-of-way into Toledo. The Toledo suburbs pose plenty of obstacles around the right-of-way, but the biggest issue with coming into Toledo from the west is the large rail yard intermodal facility, and rail junction a couple of miles west of Toledo's train station, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Plaza. Here I'm handling that with viaduct through the yard. Our precedent is once again California High-Speed Rail's LA to Anaheim Draft Environmental Impact Statement, which features a mile of viaduct through some of BNSF's facilities in Vernon, California. There is just enough room from there to get back down to ground level under the Ohio 25 bridge. Bridge replacements will be necessary into the station and a street or two may need to be closed, but overall there is room to accommodate 2 electrified tracks next to freight tracks here that would then come into modified platforms at the existing station. From South Bend to Toledo along this route, it is 146 miles. I have that taking 52 minutes for an average of 168 miles per hour. Out of Toledo to the east, tracks cross the Maumee River. I'm not worrying too much about configuration here. A high-speed project would likely take over the former Conrail yard next to the station. It is unfortunately impossible to gain enough height here to provide navigational access for the river, and a bridge over it would need to be movable like the current one, which is not ideal. To the southeast of Toledo, some greenfield right-of-way would be necessary due to various towns and curves in the way. Our example between Toledo and Cleveland is lovely Sandusky, Ohio. We would need to fly over a rail diamond there. With tracks on the north side of the right-of-way, freight would need to be reconfigured for all conceivable tracks to avoid a cemetery, but there's plenty of room in this 150-foot wide right-of-way. Since there's a rail yard consuming most of that right-of-way adjacent to the current Sandusky station, the current station would need to go to make room for a new one. Since the current one is a nice old station, that could be taken apart and reconstructed if absolutely necessary. Sandusky brings up the subject of regional stops. Our 6-hour Super Express is not stopping there, but the Lakeshore Limited does. Not only would dedicated high-speed passenger tracks be able to serve all of those stops with regional service, but many more stations would be possible along this nearly 1,000-mile route. Sandusky is good for 125 miles per hour without significant alteration of existing right-of-way, so I decided to spare the place major destruction. We'll see if that works out in the final calculations. East of Sandusky, the route would mostly stick to the current right-of-way as the area is pretty suburban moving into the Cleveland metro. And now one of the most difficult parts of the route, coming into Cleveland over the mouth of the Cuyahoga River on a big, new, beautiful, signature fixed span bridge. But it doesn't stop there. There is no good way to get back to ground level for a stop in downtown Cleveland, so I opted for an elevated station above the current Amtrak station. This is a truly tricky area without cooperation from freight rail and shows the importance of working electrification out eventually, because a bridge and aerial structure like this would cost many billions, and such costs are likely the difference in projects having any possibility of being built. This station is conveniently located next to the civic heart of Cleveland as well as Huntington Bank Field, which may no longer be the home of the Browns as soon as 2029. From Toledo, Ohio to Cleveland, Ohio, it is 108 miles. I have that taking 44 minutes for an average of 147 miles per hour. One issue out of Cleveland to the northeast is that the Cleveland suburbs extend for about 35 miles along the shores of Lake Erie. It is within that zone that we examine our next example of possible interim trouble. 8 miles out of downtown Cleveland, there is a big CSX yard and intermodal facility. There's also some sort of aggregate transfer facility there that will need to be flown over on viaduct. Then around the intermodal yard on a narrow corridor, and all of that is just barely possible at 200 miles per hour with a few industrial properties as victims. Damage there would be minimal considering. Between there and Erie, Pennsylvania, the route is pretty quick and straight with only a few necessary deviations to smooth curves. After that, we pull into Erie. This is similar to South Bend in a lot of ways. Both cities have a population of around 100,000. A bit of a political choice as it's the only possible stop in Pennsylvania. It's also the right distance from both Cleveland and Buffalo, New York. Like South Bend, the room is there in the existing right-of-way with some reconfiguration of freight rail. The original Union Station was sizable with 5 platforms, so there is plenty of room there to expand passenger access. We'll reactivate that facility, which is largely consumed by a restaurant at present. From Cleveland to Erie, it is 94 miles. I have that taking 37 minutes for an average of 152 miles per hour. East of Erie's Union Station is a complicated collection of freight and road interactions. I have our tracks taking out a park and entering a trench, but that may need to be a high viaduct. The joint CSX and Norfolk Southern right-of-way between Erie and Buffalo is quite straight and has good potential for speed. One exception is at Dunkirk and Silver Creek, New York. Both towns have a couple of jogs through them, and like previous examples, those cannot be rectified without significant damage, so we'll go around. Luckily, Interstate 90 is adjacent, and that right-of-way can be utilized until hooking back up with freight rights-of-way 10 miles to the northeast near Angola. That brings us straight into the Buffalo area at top speed before hitting a big curve. Due to complexity, downtown Buffalo is out. Buffalo has a lot of existing freight rail infrastructure in a convoluted layout, which would result in a lot of elevated new rail. Thankfully, there is room for that in places without tremendous destruction. I have our Buffalo station at the old, largely derelict Buffalo Central Terminal. This site is complicated by being in the middle of a rail junction, but we're just going to fly over that. This is a monumental Art Deco structure which has sat unused for 40 years. The enormous facilities include a 17-story tower, 125,000 square foot 5-story mail and baggage building, and roughly 20 acres of land representing a unique redevelopment possibility. From Erie to Buffalo, it is 88 miles. I have that taking 35 minutes for an average of 150 miles per hour. East of Buffalo Central, there is a large CSX yard that is daunting, but after that, the Buffalo area seems somewhat simple, and the next big challenge is Rochester. We are not stopping in Rochester since it's only about 70 miles from Buffalo, but the route does go directly through it. My solution here is an 8-mile tunnel. If Rochester were to have a station within this paradigm, it would likely be underground and downtown. I think more likely is a high-speed bypass along I-90 8 miles to the south with local access via existing freight, like we talked about with South Bend, Indiana. Next up is Syracuse. For this area, I'm going for greenfield routing north of the existing right-of-way. Interstate 90 to the south would also be a decent option. In my Empire Corridor video, I concluded that downtown Syracuse was too difficult and put my station near the airport along Interstate 90. For this video, we're going for it, hopping out of freight right-of-way and next to Interstate 690 on viaduct. This is possible with surprisingly little collateral damage. That elevated path would lead us to our Syracuse station, elevated above Herald Place on the north end of downtown. This routing involves lots of very high viaduct, but there are few possible ways through the downtown area that don't include destruction of numerous historic structures. There are several parking lots in the north downtown area waiting to be developed. Herald is 65 feet wide. For a true station, you'd probably need to demolish the building at Herald and Franklin that I left in the rendering. It is 140 miles from Buffalo to Syracuse. I have that taking 51 minutes for an average of 164 miles per hour. East of there, tracks will jump into a big tangle of flyover ramps within the Interstate 81 690 junction. The ramp for our tracks would be a 4th level in this configuration, which means about 90 feet up. Continuing on, we just barely missed the old New York Central Station building, which is now occupied by Spectrum Cable, and then rejoin the Lakeshore Limited route 4 miles further east. The big challenge for high-speed rail between Syracuse and Albany is the Mohawk River Valley. Sticking to this narrow valley is not possible for high-speed rail. The curves of the valley are not broad enough. Here is an example of some of the challenges at Utica, New York, which is where the valley starts to form up. Some of the local curves are untenable, and correcting those could involve numerous crossings of the river on the bottom land, so we'll limit that to 2 crossings in a sweeping curve through the valley. That would need to cross over Interstate 790 and a freight branch line before crossing over Genesee Street and intercepting Utica's current train station. I have my line running straight and level through here, demonstrating the possibility of regional service at this location. My tracks cross through a CSX yard on viaduct before coming back down to ground level next to CSX tracks. In my Empire Corridor video, my solution east of Utica was to follow power transmission lines. It's not a bad idea. It would require some tunneling, but it's relatively fast and cheap. For a closer look at some postulated high-speed possibilities in New York State, check that out. In this video, we'll do similarly and then jump to Albany, where I'm going to cross the Hudson River on a new bridge just north of the current rail bridge. Getting to the bridge from the west would require taking out a few blocks worth of buildings. I believe this is high enough to be a fixed span. If this visual representation isn't perfect, it's definitely possible in terms of grade. On the east side of the Hudson, dozens of single-family homes will need to go. This is one of the more destructive sections on the entire route, but they're in the way, so sorry. This is closer to a no-holds-barred video than my typical style. Blame CNN. Then across the Rensselaer Station parking lot on Viaduct, and we'll park our high-speed station right next to the existing station over the parking structure. I didn't really see any other way of doing it adjacent to the existing station. That's going to bring us to our Syracuse-Albany travel times. That is 135 miles by this routing. I have that taking 50 minutes for an average of 162 miles per hour. Out of Rensselaer to the south, plenty of challenges await this journey along the Hudson River into New York City. The existing route hugs the shoreline, and that is rarely amenable to 200 mile per hour geometry. Adjustments may be physically possible, but whether or not they're environmentally and politically possible is another matter. In my Empire Corridor video, I concluded a 15-mile tunnel under the Hudson Highlands would be necessary to get this currently 110 mile per hour line up to true high speed, so let's do this. That's going to start near the city of Beacon. The freight rail tracks will curve along the river. Our high-speed rail tracks will continue straight into the hillside at 200 miles per hour. Upon closer inspection, this particular tunnel would need to be 20 miles long, and I have roughly 30 miles of tunnel total between Albany and New York City to consistently maintain high speed. We will emerge from that 20-mile tunnel at Croton-on-Hudson, where we will hook up with MTA electrification at its Croton-Harmon station. MTA is third rail into New York City from there, so you have a dilemma. Either MTA would need to convert to catenary, or we would need to use dual mode trains. Third rail is okay for our train here. The geometry of the remaining 32 miles into New York Penn Station doesn't support speed beyond 90 miles per hour in most cases anyway. Scheduling is a bigger issue, as service would be concurrent with MTA for 2/3 of the distance. Amtrak currently takes 41 to 43 minutes. We can probably knock 5 minutes off of that with better acceleration and faster running in Manhattan. A good portion of the Empire Corridor that runs through Manhattan has been built over, but there are a few places where it peaks through to the surface. This part is not electrified, but extend whatever we end up using south of Croton-Harmon and we're good to go. This also brings up the subject of battery power as a dual mode alternative. In the future, that could also be an answer to gaining access to city cores along freight rail without having to hang wires. We'll see how the technology advances. Then finally, we enter a big curve into the tunnel that connects to New York Penn Station, concluding this version of the roughly 960-mile Lakeshore Limited route. From Albany to New York City, it is 135 miles. I have that taking 1 hour and 17 minutes for an average of 105 miles per hour. Now for the moment you've all been waiting for, the final tally. If you've had your calculator running, you probably already know This 929-mile high-speed rail route from Chicago to New York City would take 6 hours and 34 minutes for an average of 141 miles per hour. For cost, we had some expensive bridges in the Chicago area. We drove through the cores of several cities, including a spectacular bridge and viaduct in Cleveland. And we had a good amount of tunneling in upstate New York. For all of that, along 929 miles, I have a cost estimate of $189 billion. That is $203 million per mile for a routing that is far more aggressive than I would normally consider. Even still, over those 929 miles, this route should only consume about 1,150 structures. Before counting CNN out completely, let's keep in mind this is for an express route with 7 intermediate stops. Can we get under 6 hours with a pure express? And if so, what's the maximum amount of stops possible still under 6 hours? First of all, we'll bump top speed up to 220 miles per hour. That will knock off 15 minutes at an undetermined extra expense. That leaves us with 6 hours 19 minutes, 20 minutes to go. Eliminating all intermediate stops would save 28 minutes. 5 hours 51 minutes is possible as a pure express at 220 miles per hour and expense of close to $200 billion. Does this validate CNN? We can add stops back in. Take your pick of the 3 largest metros, Cleveland, Buffalo, and Albany, but you only get one. A fairly unsatisfying but speedy route. So yeah, it's possible, but something like this will never happen. It's too expensive and has way too many planning issues. Perhaps something between that and our 9.5-hour Acela? Would an 8-hour Lakeshore Limited with 8 stops be worth it for something like $125 billion? Let me know in the comments. I hope you enjoyed this presentation. There are plenty more videos to come. I don't have anything in mind at the moment and am planning to take a short break after a hectic year. I have a couple of extra ways you can support the channel. Check out that super thanks button below the video or my poster store where you can get yourself a railroad themed poster and help out the channel at the same time. But that's all for now. Until next time, I'll see you on that big beautiful freeway.